Okay, good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you very much for joining us today. We thought that we would like to share with you a little bit of the practical experience of how we went about developing a front of pack label that we tested within South Africa as an exercise. This was a research exercise, but hoping that it would be informing government decisions and can be used in our policy development process. So I would like to introduce you to my colleagues. I'm Rina Swart from the University of the Western Cape, and assisted by Makoma Bupape from University of Limpopo, and Tamarin Frank, University of the Western Cape, and then Safura Abdul Karim from Priceless at the Wits University. So just an overview of, of the outline of our presentation. We will quickly go through a couple of steps with regards to the process of developing a front of pack system, decision points. Then we will talk about the process of developing a nutrient profile model that fits or that accompanies that front of pack labeling. And then we will, may I just ask about, somebody's mic is open. Can you please, can we just mute, can everybody just mute their microphones, please? There's a lot of noise. Okay, all right. So then we will talk through the choice of front of pack labeling system and how we went about deciding on which signs and logos we will be using, how we tested that in a randomized controlled trial, and finally a presentation on aspects of domestic law and international commitments that one needs to take into consideration. So to start with, I will use specifically the South African example to just share some ideas and reflect a little bit about front of pack labeling. So in my opinion, the factors, and there may be others that we're missing, but I think it's important that one looks at the nutritional situation in a country to understand what the specific issues are in South Africa, and I'll get back to that data later on. Our nutrition situation prompted us to implement front of pack labeling, and it was underpinned by the patterns of food consumption that I will share with you a little bit later. Then again, one also needs to look at the policy arena. What are your existing policies? How comprehensive are they? And do they support each other, or are there other gaps that should rather be filled before you embark on a front of pack label? The track record with regards to policy implementation is important. Capacity and resources, who sits around the table, the timeline, and of course your consumers themselves, as well as your producers, the educational level, responsibilities, and then finally some unintended consequences that we experienced. So just to talk through the nutrition situation in South Africa, many of you may have seen these graphs, which is part of the publication by Yassarah et al., and that illustrates the obesity trajectory in the different countries. And you see South Africa there right in the middle, with the top lines in each of these graphs illustrating the obesity in women. Then the blue line underneath that, obesity in men, and the bottom two lines in light pink and blue being that in children, girls in pink and boys in blue. And you see that we have a serious problem with obesity alone, around exceeding 40% in women, combined with overweight, that's around 67% of the population being overweight and obese. And although it is lower in men, obesity is lower in men, their overweight is higher. So we assume that that line will also be going upwards quite significantly soon. And very worrying is then children, with that very sharp increase over the last 10, 15 years. So that was the background to our decision around the need for a front of pack label. Just to give you an idea of the prevalence of undernutrition and obesity, and the fact that it's actually coexisting in South Africa. So I've just, as 2 countries or 3 countries, added some data from the latest demographic health survey. In South Africa, stunting in urban areas compared to rural areas, 21%, 27%, whereas overweight and obesity combined in urban areas higher, but yeah, a little bit higher, but not so drastic as in other countries. So you see, for example, in Kenya and in Ghana, the difference between urban and rural is exceeding 20 percentage points, whereas in South Africa, it's only around 3 percentage points. So we've got a serious problem of obesity and overweight coexisting with undernutrition in the form of stunting, because our stunting rate is quite comparable to that of Kenya, although in Ghana it is lower. Sorry. So I said the other component that we need to talk about is, or to look at, is food retail. What do we know about the food retail pattern in South Africa? And one researcher described that the share of expenditure on sugar-sweetened beverages and snacks was higher than that on fruit and vegetables in all socioeconomic areas. And this was sort of confirmed by some of the other researchers that food secure shoppers, although they spent more money on food per se, but the types of items they're purchasing are very similar to those of food insecure shoppers. So that spending behavior on products that are high in nutrients of concern appears in both food secure and food insecure groups. In South Africa specifically, and I think that's true for many of the African countries, many of our enterprises in informal settlements trade in food, because that contribute to cash employment and livelihoods. However, because of access to electricity, storage capacity, all of that, it's often limited to packaged goods with a longer shelf life and not necessarily fresh produce. And all of this, of course, is then supporting consumption of processed foods. The slide, you see the food balance sheets, information projected, and that the overall food groups contributing to energy intake had some changes here and there, but remained overall relatively stable over the last 20 odd years. However, if we look at the consumption and we analyze that information from the the balance sheets, and we compare it with Euromonitor and try to calculate a per capita consumption per day. So even though our energy intake may be sufficient, when you look at the particular food groups, you'll see consumption in South Africa of fruit and of vegetables are particularly low. And the protein intake is higher than the recommendations that, or minimum requirements that we have, just to give you a sense of the consumption. If we look at packaged foods, and this comes from Euromonitor more, if we look at ready-to-eat breakfast cereals and then carbonated drinks, you see a very steep incline over the last 15 to 20 years, with sales and consumptions in almost all of the groups. We can go into the detail, but carbonated drinks specifically, and then the ready-to-eat breakfast cereals has increased significantly. So that gave you a picture of our food environment. What do we, the scenario look like in terms of policy environment within South Africa? So we did a review of the policy landscape in around 2017, and we actually have quite a number of good policies in South Africa. Implementation is often an issue, but it is not necessarily due to a lack of policies that we have challenges. So with front of pack labeling as a possible policy action, it is important to mention that it's definitely not a magic bullet. Front of pack labeling can add one component in terms of consumers' perceptions and their purchasing choices, but it needs to be supported by a whole bouquet of other policies as well. So we do have in South Africa already the health promotion levy that you might be aware of. They are currently in the process of reviewing the strategy for prevention of obesity, and that would be a 2022 to 2030 strategy. So it needs to fit within that, and we will talk later about other policies. So, for example, making healthy food also cheaper and more accessible, because it is not sufficient to just be on the warning and on the taxing and on the negative side of policies, but that is necessary and it has a place, because it speaks to the food environment as well as to the choices that individuals will be making. Within a country, one also needs to look at the track record with regards to policy implementation, and your capacity and resources with regards to drafting of regulations, information on the back of pack, the nutrition information on the package, capacity with regards to monitoring and evaluation. And on specifically monitoring and evaluation, I would not say that we have sufficient resources in South Africa. It is important that those sections needs to be strengthened should you want to have achieve the maximum benefit of the policy that you wish to implement. And I think if you look at other countries where it has been implemented, evidence is beginning to come out on that. In terms of the decision-making with regards to the policies, it is quite important to look at who sits around the policy table, because there may be conflicts of interest. There may, and those conflicts may sway or delay. Most countries who have reported on implementation of a warning label have indicated that their own policies have been delayed, or they were then forced to implement them in stages in order to meet the requirements of other individuals around the decision-making table. And industry, of course, as a major stakeholder in food provisioning, is to be expected to exercise some influence in that particular area. And then it is also important that I think there be independence of evidence. So as part of our front of pack label evaluation project, we did have discussions and consultations with the Department of Health, but we tried very hard to keep the research project as an independent development of evidence, because it's true that influence can work both ways, depending on who the parties are.
Hi, Prof. Rina, can I quickly interject?
Yes.
This is Phyllis.
Sure.
Should I make the announcement?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so we have another breakout session going on. Per our program, we have 2 parallel streams. So where we currently are is the front of pack labeling, which is being conducted by Prof. Rina. There's another session going on, which is related to food prices, which is being conducted by Prof. Masters in the breakout room. So if you'd like to join that, kindly click on the breakout room icon on your screen. When you click on it and you scroll down, you will see that there is a breakout room 2 labeled food prices. So you'd be able to join that so that you are part of that capacity building session. So just a quick reminder, because this is the plenary, when you join, you come here straight away, but you can move into the food prices session, which is ongoing in room 2 by clicking on the breakout rooms icon. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so just the first time I had to look at the screen, it's at the bottom of the screen. You'll see those 4 squares next to each other. Yeah. That's the breakout room, if you could just click there. Okay, so the other component that one needs to consider is, for example, the education of consumers, because that may influence their understanding of labels and of nutrition information. And I think different countries definitely have got different scenarios, needs to tailor this. One specific example in which we tailored it is that, and Makoma will talk about that a little bit later, is that we were asked by consumers to add an icon depicting, you know, a representative, a picture of salt and sugar in order to facilitate that. And then timelines. I mean, in South Africa, our experience has been, it took us quite a long time. This is not something, if you need to consider all of these factors, it takes you a while to decide on all your different components that needs to form part of such a front of pack labeling process. And you need to plan for sufficient time to conduct your research into the development of your label, into the development of your nutrient profiling model that you will use to inform your cut points for the label, and then to evaluate the impact of such labels. And then, of course, there are always unintended consequences that you may not have foreseen. So in South Africa, for example, and Tamarin will refer to that, we have seen, for example, as an outcome of the health promotion levy, that the use of artificial sweeteners has increased dramatically. And that was unintended, to some extent expected with regards to reformulation, but it definitely adds now another point of concern that we may have to consider. Okay, so that's my brief presentation on the aspects to consider. I will now stop sharing and hand over to Tamarin, who will be talking about the development, the process, as well as the assessment of the nutrient profiling model, which we developed to complement the nutrient profiling, the front of pack labeling.
Thanks very much, Rina. As Rina has said, I'm going to share a bit about considerations in developing a nutrient profiling model. I will try to keep it somewhat generic so that one can think about how to apply it in different circumstances other than South Africa as well. I did present last week on the whole process that we went about with the South African development, and we do also have a publication. I'll share the link in the chat a bit later for that. So the first question is perhaps, why are we so concerned about nutrient profiling models, and what exactly are they? And the definition of them could be that it is the science of how we categorize food based on their nutritional composition, which are related to reasons for preventing disease and promoting health. And so this can be used then to underpin various different policies and regulations, and that would help us either to identify foods that are healthy that we may want to promote, or alternatively foods that are more unhealthy that we may want to restrict in regulations. So some of the regulations that have been identified that nutrient profiling models are helpful for are front of pack labeling, marketing restrictions, regulations in the food environment or in government institutions like hospitals for taxation of foods, to identify foods that may carry health claims, as well as to encourage reformulation of products. And as I've said, we need to consider whether the nutrient profiling model is one that is going to be encouraging healthy or healthier foods, or one that may identify the unhealthy foods to restrict. And depending on which nutrient profiling model is used, a food may be categorized differently based on the nutrient profiling model. This is just an example of a granola bar, which of course is quite a mixed product because it does have healthy components like nuts and some fiber and some dried fruit, but it's also got some more unhealthy components like added sugar and chocolate. So there would be some fat in there, and that of course then, depending on the criteria of the nutrient profiling model, you would find it identified differently based on the considerations behind the specific nutrient profiling model. So there's a fair amount of literature that exists around steps to follow when one is developing a nutrient profiling model, and I'm going to discuss it, summarize it down into 5 steps. One never finishes step 1 and then moves on to step 3 and then step 4. It's very much a backwards and forwards process throughout, and all of these things are being considered at the same time. But the considerations are about the purpose of the nutrient profiling model and the target population, what nutrients and food components you're going to include, the base and the criteria for the model, the exact numbers and cut points or thresholds that you may include, and then evaluating whether the nutrient profiling model is fit for the purpose that you've identified it for. So in throughout the process, it is very, very important, and this is especially when it is something that's going to be used to underpin regulations. You want to make sure that you've really got a solid scientific basis, because we anticipate whenever it comes to things like this, that the food and beverage industry is not going to like any regulations around food. And so you want to make sure that the nutrient profiling model really is evidence-based and scientific. And so throughout the process, document the process, make sure it's transparent. And it's very important that there isn't any industry involvement in the development process, that the people involved, be it government and then the stakeholders, are not industry in the actual research and development of the model. So the first step is to determine the purpose and target population for the nutrient profiling model. And here are some considerations, and Rina has already discussed quite nicely what we considered for South Africa. But you would consider what the nutritional status is, whether there is a problem with overweight and obesity, or stunting and undernutrition, or perhaps a combined of both, as we have in South Africa. What the disease burden is that you're looking at and that you're concerned with, that you want to address. How far along the nutrition transition is in the country, whether there is a lot of ultra-processed food being consumed, a lot of food that would have packages on labels on the packages or not, as well as what the policy priorities are in the country that is being considered. And then it's very, very important to really thoroughly consider the purpose. Is it to identify unhealthy foods to restrict, or is it to promote healthy foods? We find that the nutrient profiling models that are used for these different purposes are quite different. And so although one can use one nutrient profiling model for both, from our experience, we did find that quite difficult. And it is just very important that the government that is doing this is clear about what they want to achieve with the nutrient profiling model that they select. And then, of course, who is the target? Are we looking at children or adults, or the entire population? The next step is then to select the nutrients and food components that will be included. And the usual ones to consider would be those that are known to be potentially harmful to health, which would be your energy, your fat, your sodium, sugar, and non-sugar sweetener. And one could then consider what the food supply looks like in terms of these nutrients, as well as how much of these types of nutrients are being considered in the country that you're considering. And then positive nutrients that one may consider would be protein, fruits, vegetables, nuts, and legumes, fiber and whole grains, vitamins and minerals, and your polyunsaturated fatty acids. And again, depending on whether or not you've identified healthy or unhealthy approach for your nutrient profiling model. And so then you would make that decision. Are we disqualifying nutrients to limit? Are we going to look at both our nutrients to limit as well as our nutrients to encourage? Or do we perhaps make a conditional criteria that only if there are no nutrients to limit in a food, then we will look at nutrients to encourage? So these are some of the considerations. The next step is to select the type, criteria, and base for the nutrient profiling model that is going to be used. And when we talk about the base, what this is referring to is whether it's going to be in a percentage energy or per 100 grams format or per serving format. So one needs to consider the pros and cons of each approach and which is most appropriate for your setting that you're considering. For South Africa, this was fairly easy to decide because we already used a per 100 gram approach, and it also aligns with what Codex Alimentarius recommends countries to do. However, a percentage of an energy approach could be useful. It aligns with some of the WHO guidelines. And it also helps with foods that are consumed in smaller quantities. And serving sizes, again, for smaller serving sizes can be useful. However, this is an approach we've seen the industry manipulate quite a lot, because it's very easy for them to decide what the serving size is. There's no guideline as to what a serving size must be, so they can decide for themselves whether people are going to eat one block of chocolate or a whole slab of chocolate. So of course that makes it easier to manipulate. And then one also needs to determine whether an across the board or category specific approach would be more appropriate. And so again, it's context specific, and there are pros and cons to both approaches. We in South Africa went for an across the board approach because we were concerned about the human resources required for monitoring and evaluation, and that the category specific would be more complicated to do. And it just was easier to make it an across the board approach. Of course, the category specific can sometimes help to account for intrinsic differences that you may see between, for instance, the fats and oils category versus your fruits and vegetables. So there are pros and cons to both approaches. And then also whether one wants to have a scoring approach or a cut point, a threshold. And in South Africa, we went for the threshold or cut point because it was much simpler. There was a binary, this is too high, this is acceptable, and that worked for our approach. But if you are looking perhaps at including healthy components, you may want to rather make use of a score, because then you can have an overall score including both positive and negative nutrients. So yeah, you need to consider whether it's easy to implement, what type of calculations are going to be involved, and how that will affect the monitoring and evaluation of the nutrient profiling model, as well as what current regulations recommend, and how what you are choosing aligns with, for instance, what Codex Alimentarius might recommend. One then needs to select exactly what numbers and thresholds you're going to be using. And because there are already a vast number of existing successful nutrient profiling models, the recommendation is to adapt an existing one rather than invent one from scratch. And so based on what you have decided in your previous steps, whether you're wanting a nutrient profiling model that identifies only nutrients to limit, or one that includes both nutrients to limit and encourage, whether you're looking at a per 100 gram approach or a percentage energy approach, whether you want a scoring or a threshold, you will then choose a nutrient profiling model based on that. We chose the Chile nutrient profiling model to adapt because that was most similar to the criteria that we had identified. So just for interest's sake, this is the criteria we chose for South Africa, which for sodium, total sugar, and saturated fat was exactly the same as the Chile cut points, but we excluded energy, which Chile has, and we added a criteria for containing any non-sugar sweetener. And we also applied it where Chile applies it to foods that have added sodium, added saturated fat, or added sugar. We used free sugar rather than added sugar to account for 100% fruit juice specifically. And then once one has chosen what you think is an appropriate nutrient profiling model for the purposes that you've identified, it is important to evaluate the performance of that proposed nutrient profiling model. And in order to do that, one would need to collect data on the packaged food supply, if you're using it for packaged foods in the country. And this can be done by taking photographs in supermarkets and then entering that into a spreadsheet online. And it is quite a time-intensive process. but it does allow for one then to be able to apply your proposed nutrient profiling model along with other nutrient profiling models and assess how it performs against the packaged food supply in the setting that you are using. There is no gold standard for classifying healthfulness of foods, which makes it quite difficult to validate a nutrient profiling model. It's very difficult because there really isn't a very clear cut, this is healthy, this is unhealthy. It makes validation difficult. And we also find that some of the recommended methods can be quite time consuming and expensive to do. And so the alternative perhaps way to go about it is to test how well your proposed nutrient profiling model performs when one looks at the packaged food supply in the setting that you are proposing it for, as well as how it performs against other nutrient profiling models in that same setting. And so that is what we did with R1. On this slide, ours is referred to as the SA FOPL, front of pack labeling nutrient profiling model, and we compared it to a few other nutrient profiling models to see how it performed. And this just shows how many foods would carry a front of pack label if it was used for that purpose. The first darkest bar is the total, the second is foods, and the third lightest bar is beverages. And we found that our nutrient profiling model performed quite similarly to the Chilean warning octagon model, except that it was much stricter for beverages because of our non-sugar sweetener criteria, as well as our free sugar rather than added sugar qualifying criteria that we made use of. And yeah, I think that's, my time is up. So that's me. Thank you very much. Over to Makoma.
Good afternoon. Can I go ahead?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Makoma. I will be presenting on the process that we followed in South Africa to develop a front of pack warning label. So this is what I'm going to present now. It's part of the process that we followed in testing different labels that we tested among South Africans to determine the one label that would be most effective in communicating nutrition information to South African consumers. As one of the steps, we developed the warning label, and my presentation is all about the process that we followed. And Prof. Rina will then take us through the whole process, the randomized control trial, where the warning label was tested against other labels, as she will share more on that. So before we developed the warning label, we went through different stages. One of the first things that we did was we read a lot or a little bit on the different types of front of pack labeling that are in existence. And I'm not going to go through this. I assume we all are familiar with that. But one of the critical questions that we asked ourselves was, somebody's mic is, thank you very much. There's a bit of noise in the background. I request that everybody mute the mics, please. Okay, so in order for us to come up with the warning label, some of the questions that we asked ourselves were, what the objective of developing this label? And like Tamrin has indicated, one of the questions that we're asking is, are we trying to help South Africans understand the overall nutrient composition? Are we trying to look for a label that would assist one to choose healthier products? Are we looking for a label that would assist consumers to identify unhealthy products or identify products high in nutrients of concern? Are we looking for a label that would encourage reformulation of products? And after we had asked ourselves all these questions, what came out clear was we wanted to design a label which would enable consumers to easily identify unhealthy products. So taking South Africa as a case study, what we did was, as Prof. Rina has already indicated, we looked at the profile of diseases in South Africa, and we realized that the prevalence of non-communicable diseases was high, overweight was also high and increasing, as well as obesity. And also we took note of the influx or high accessibility of ultra-processed food in South Africa, and looking at the association, the existing evidence between obesity, overweight, non-communicable diseases, and poor dietary intake. For us, we wanted to identify a system that would enable consumers to be able to identify products containing excessive nutrients, consumers to be able to identify unhealthy food. And we also wanted to come up or to implement a system which would discourage purchasing and consumption of unhealthy food. And the warning label seemed to be that front of pack label that would assist consumers to be able to achieve the three. And what also came up tops for warning label was when we went through the literature, we realized that studies conducted in countries, especially low to middle income countries, indicated that warning labels were well understood by people of various educational level. So for South Africa, that came out as a label that would be implementable. So we then undertook a study to determine how consumers would feel about warning labels. And we also wanted to, within South Africa, design a label that South Africans would easily relate to. And we also wanted South Africans to come up with elements that for them would warn them when they see the label on the picture. So, and as a starting point, we said we would design a label that would be easily understood by everybody in South Africa, irrespective of their social standing, irrespective of their educational status. What we did was we conducted extensive literature. We used, for example, the WHO framework for the development of front of pack label. We also looked at what other countries are doing. We looked at literature behind warning label, what makes a warning label to be effective. We also looked into the South African context. What are the images that in South Africa depict warning, depict danger? And we came up with different images, as we can all see. Things like a stop sign, things like a triangle, a red triangle with an exclamation point in the middle. So we came up with different images, and looking at what else is available in other countries, we looked at Chile, for example, we looked at Israel, we looked at Brazil, and we saw what they had. And we had a group of experts who looked at all the different images that we had gathered, and they assist the research team to identify the most, I'm going to say, effective, according to the team, the most effective warning symbol or element that they thought South Africans would easily relate to. And we, at the end, came up with several prototypes. I just have a few in front of us, the different prototypes that the expert team assisted us with. For example, we had a red triangle with some words high in salt and including some icon. others were octagon. On some labels we had, for example, a hand indicating store. So we had different types that the expert committee assisted us with. At the end, we came up with different labels that we then took to South African consumers. And the South African consumers are the ones who, through a qualitative study, assisted us to come up with one label that we then proposed to be a South African winning label. And I'm now going to present the findings of the qualitative study that we conducted among South African consumers. This study was conducted in 3 provinces within the country, and we included adults aged 18 to 50, and we diversified the groups because we had different focus groups, and we diversified them according to different ages, according to income, gender, literacy, and whether they were coming from urban or rural areas. And at the end, we interviewed 113 participants. And for the stimuli, we used 4 different food packages. We had a tub of yogurt, a packet of crisp. We also had a box of cereal and a bottle of soda. And on each food product, we put different symbols that I will get into now. We took pictures and compiled like an atlas, and then we projected the pictures we projected them, and participants would then look at the pictures and they would tell us why they thought a certain symbol would work and why not, and which one would they choose as depicting winning for them. So these are the different elements that we tested. I will quickly go through them. I will start on the left-hand side. We compared the use of a triangle versus the use of an octagon. And participants had to say which of the 2 shapes speak winning to them. We also looked at the red triangle versus the black triangle, and they had to choose one. We also tested the white background versus the black background, the one at the bottom left. You can see there's one where black triangle is put against the white, a black triangle put against the white background. We call it holding stripe. Or would participants relate more to a black triangle against the black background? We also tested different icons, because one of the strong points of the winning label is using the use of icons as a way of indicating the nutrient that is in excess. And we wanted to see which one would participant identify as depicting winning. So for example, for fat, we had 4 different pictures and they had to pick one that talked winning for them. And for salt, as you can see, we also had 4 different pictures. Sugar as well, they were also comparing and they had to come up with one. And then again, we also tested we call it winning device. My top left, there is a label with text winning, and then there's a triangle close to the winning text with an exclamation mark, and then there's another triangle with the icon together with the text high in salt. So this is one device that we tested and we wanted to see how participants would feel. And other food products only contained the triangle with high in salt together with winning only. There was no exclamation mark. And on other products, there was just a black triangle, and another product, there was just a red one, and they had to come up with one. And also we tested the use of small letters versus capital letters, as you can see at the bottom. And then lastly, we tested the position. We had products where the winning label was at the bottom of the food pack, and comparing that to where the label was at the top. And we also tested different label size. as they would appear on the front of the package, and we wanted participants or consumers to tell us which label size would they prefer. We also wanted to test an icon for energy, but this one we ended up dropping because there was a lot of confusion when it comes to the terminology, calories, kilojoules, energy. So we ended up dropping this one. And in terms of data analysis, we arranged our results into themes. And these I presented last week, but I will just quickly go through the themes. We had 5 themes, and from the themes, all consumers were positive about the winning label, irrespective of their background, and they saw benefits attached to the winning label. They felt their children will benefit. They felt the winning label was educational just by being there on the food product without anybody explaining a lot. And others, in terms of perceived behavior modification, others felt they would start being cautious in terms of consumption because of the label. And in terms of positive elements, they liked the color, which I will talk more about that, the position, the text, symbols, etc. And in terms of who would benefit, they perceived that all consumers would benefit, although others felt people with medical conditions. And these are some of the codes, which I will not go into because of time, but these are some of the codes that we got. For example, they said when I send a child to buy something, they would see the sign and know that this is good, which means they felt even the children would be able to relate to the winning label, even if their parents were not there. And one of the things that came out was they felt the use of icons, for example, a spoonful of sugar would be helpful and would be easily understood by the less literate, young people, and the elderly. So these are the codes that we got. I would say it starts with the term winning. Obviously, you know that you now know it is something that is not good. It makes us aware. So these are the kind of codes that we got. I just want to share what we got at the end. In terms of the fat, the elements that were preferred are the ones on the left-hand side. So in terms of the saturated fat, they felt the icon with the big F spoke more to them as compared to the other 3. They found the other 3 confusing. They did not know what the words stood for, but the big F for them spoke fat. And then in terms of sugar, they liked the teaspoon, which was heaped, and sugar even overflowing as an indication that there's too much sugar. And salt again, the salt shaker running like that. They felt it says to them too much salt has been added into this food product. And in terms of text, they preferred the uppercase to the small case. And in terms of the symbol shape, the triangle was a winner because participants said this is the shape, the symbol that is used in construction to show that the places there's some danger in the area, or when people are cleaning, when it is slippery. And in terms of color, there was a little bit of a split between black and red, but black ended up winning because they felt red, if a package is colorful, the red would fade in the background. So the black and white one, they said it was a winner because it would pop against the colorful background. And in terms of the winning device, of the 4, they liked the one with the exclamation mark because they said the exclamation mark puts emphasis on the fact that consumers are being warned. So they said when they see the exclamation mark, then that would scare them. And in terms of the background or the holding strap, the white one was a winner because again, they said it made the black triangle more visible against the white background. And in terms of placement, they preferred the label to be placed at the top, because they say when we pick something from the shelf, we most of the time see the top part as compared to the bottom. So it would be more effective if the label is positioned at the top of the package. And in terms of the label size, the response was the bigger the label size, the better. And that is what won. So finally, as a final winning label, putting all the elements together, this is the label that we are proposing for South Africa, having taken all the points into consideration. The use of the word winning, inclusion of the exclamation mark, the white background, the black triangle, and those different icons for the different nutrients, and the inclusion of the word high in, whichever nutrient is in excess. And in conclusion, we are saying for South Africa, elements such as black color, triangle, the use of the words warning and high in, the use of the exclamation mark and contrasting white background could enhance the label's ability to increase perception of the risk of consumption of unhealthy products. And our results suggest that a policy mandating nutrition warning labels on unhealthy packaged food could improve consumers' understanding of health risks and help them identify unhealthy food and drinks. Thank you.
Thank you, Makoma. I will quickly just run through the findings of the randomized control trial that we used for testing the effectiveness of the labels. And we did it, the purpose of, or the primary objectives were to evaluate which warning label would be the best at conveying information on nutrients of concern that are found in excessive amounts in packaged foods, conveying information on unhealthiness, and discouraging consumers from purchasing such products. It was done in a randomized controlled trial with a nationally representative sample, and the hypothesis was that the newly developed front of pack label, which Makoma explained the process, will perform better than the GDA or the multiple traffic light. We've chosen GDA and multiple traffic light because the GDA currently appears on some products in the country, and the traffic light was recommended by another group. So that's why we included those. We tested, used 6 different products for our testing. The products represent a different range of healthiness or unhealthiness in the eyes of the consumer, and they were also single products and then paired products. So the same questions, but where it was, is this product high in, or is this product unhealthy for single ones? For the paired ones, they had to choose which one is the highest in a particular nutrient, or which one is most unhealthy. Now, the participants to the study all saw each one of these labels without a label. These are all imaginary products that we made up. However, for the nutrient content and the allocation of the various warning signs, we did look at similar products in the country and used that nutrition content to assign the different warning labels. So here you see a particular example with the 3 different labels, all on the top right-hand side with the warning on. It was nationally represented sample from all of the different provinces. And just to give you a quick overview, so everybody saw the products without a label. Then they were exposed to the products again, but this time with a warning label on it. And each person saw only 1 warning label. So the division between the 3 warning labels were about a third each, and that was randomly allocated by changing each field worker only carrying one particular set and randomly deciding who's going to go first, second, third at their data collection. The design was then a within as well as a between the different labels, perceptions, and the percentages that you see in little circles, colorful circles, indicate the perception of the consumers with regards to the healthfulness, the unhealthiness of a particular product. So more than 80% thought that crisps is unhealthy, and less than 20% thought that fruit juice will be unhealthy. So it's the whole range. Because there was a slight difference between on geolocation of the distribution within these different 3 label conditions and tertiary education, we controlled for that in our analysis. So the findings illustrate an average partial effect of the 3 labels to assist consumers in correctly identifying products high in salt and high in saturated fat. And you can see the blue bars represents warning labels, consistently informing consumers better about the product being high in salt or in saturated level, fat. And you can see that on the green and the red bars being the multiple traffic light and the GDA, it was lower. The percentage change from seeing the product without the label and seeing the product with the label. And when we get to sugar, again, consistently better performing warning label, whereas the GDA and the multiple traffic light even had an effect of what I would call confusion, because participants who deemed a product unhealthy before when they saw it without the label, then changed their mind and deemed it healthy when they saw it with the label. So that was with sugar. And here you see the results for unhealthiness. Again, the same picture. The warning label performing better all the time, whereas inconsistent performance between GDA and multiple traffic light. It's not indicated the p-values, but all of these differences were statistically significant. So in conclusion, our recommendation then is from our research that the black triangle on a holding strip and with a warning triangle perform best to inform consumers about products high in sugar, salt, and saturated fat, that the larger size was more effective. I didn't show that to you, but we questioned them about that. The position top right corner, and that we recommend it be for sugar, salt, and saturated fat based on the nutrient profiling model. We recommend that it's mandatory, given the literature findings on confusion and performance of other labels and how industry engages with labels if it's voluntary. But that front of pack labeling is only one of a whole combination, and that it is complementing the health promotion levy that we already have, but that we also recommend it be used to combine with restriction of marketing to children, including the foods or the products that's made available for sale in child-centered environments such as school food environments, and it could be considered in terms of taxation of unhealthy foods. We did receive funding, and I just need for our research project, and I need to acknowledge them. Thank you very much. Safura, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you can both hear me and see my slides. My name is Safura Abdul Karim. and I am a researcher at the SAMRC Center for Health Economics and Decision Science based at Wits University. And I'm also a member of the Front of Pack Labeling Scientific Working Group. Today, I will be talking through some of the trade and other legal issues related to the development of a front of pack label in South Africa. I think this is something that not a lot of people often consider as part of their research, but we thought it was quite important, given that front of pack labels are usually implemented through some type of legal mechanism. So the legal research that was conducted focused really on 4 issues within front of pack labeling. The first was around determining the purpose of the regulation. The second was sort of around some of the legal components of a regulation, such as making it mandatory versus voluntary, what type of pathway, etc. The next thing that we looked at is refining some of the technical components of the label when actually looking at turning it into something that is a legal mechanism. There are some things that you need to prescribe that may not be ordinarily determined in the course of developing a label. And then the last issue of consideration is around trade implications. So when thinking through the purpose of a front of pack label, it is clear that many countries are adopting different types of labeling systems, and this map kind of illustrates some of the different types of systems that have been adopted. Some of them are warning labels, like what Professor Swart and my colleagues have gone through. Others have been endorsement labels, like what was done in Denmark, or the Nutri-Score model in Australia, for example. And these different types of systems achieve different purposes. And so for that reason, a key issue is determining the purpose of the regulation and its underlying justification. If there isn't a clear link between the purpose of the regulation and the underlying justification for adopting it, or the evidence base and underpinning it, then that regulation or whatever measure is being adopted becomes incredibly susceptible to legal challenges. So I went over it briefly, but basically when we were looking at this, we thought that front of pack labeling could achieve 4 main purposes. It could educate consumers, disincentivize the consumption of unhealthy foods, anchor other health promoting policies, and protect children's health. And as I mentioned before, there should be a direct link between the aim of the front of pack labeling system and the system selected. So when we discuss these aims, the logical system to adopt flowing from this is a warning label system, because one of the chief purposes of the label is to disincentivize the consumption of unhealthy foods. Beyond this, it's quite important that a front of pack label align with the existing legal system. And one way to do that is to anchor the system in human or constitutional rights that exist in a given country. And most countries in Africa do recognize a right to health and a right to food that can be used to anchor a front of pack labeling system. This slide has a quote from a statement from the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health that was also endorsed by the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, basically arguing or finding that specifically front of package warning label regulations are essential to the realization and protection of the right to health. And so that provides quite a strong basis upon which a government can defend a decision to adopt a front of pack labeling system. But human rights frameworks also provide a mechanism to guide government action. So they also prescribe the way in which a government should go about adopting regulations. And much of this aligns to a lot of the research that was done, things like adopting a participatory approach to the research, as well as ensuring that there's robust evidence underpinning the regulation. Those are key components of a human rights-based approach to front of pack labeling. And so any country that's choosing to adopt a front of pack labeling system should adopt similar types of approaches before actually finally implementing that system. The next thing to consider, which I mentioned, was what is the regulatory pathway that's being adopted, and how does that influence the type of regulation that's being adopted? So for example, in South Africa, there was a draft regulation called R429 that was published in 2015, and that contained a voluntary front of pack labeling system that followed what we know as the traffic light system. So that seems to be a potentially viable pathway to adopt front of pack labeling systems in South Africa. That pathway may look different in other countries, but this is what it looked like in ours. And so we decided to map out what the regulation making process ought to look like. And one can see that, you know, there's various commenting periods, there's a need to undertake a socioeconomic impact assessment, etc. And all of these steps, it's critical that they be complied with to ensure that the regulation is actually robust enough to withstand industry challenge. And in fact, most of what the legal aspects of a front of pack label are concerned with is actually that question of how do we ensure that this regulation can withstand any potential challenges from industry. And we have seen that issue realized in several countries where after passing a front of pack label, it's been almost immediately challenged, particularly in South America. So it is quite important to take these things into consideration. At a substantive level, there are things that need to be considered in developing a front of pack label regulation. And for this, we drew quite a lot on how plain tobacco, plain packaging regulations and laws were developed, for example, in Australia and other places. And the key is to balance prescribing detailed parameters for the implementation of the label, while also allowing for a degree of flexibility and accommodating some of the difficulties that may be faced when industry actors try and implement the system. So, you know, it's things like, for example, if you look at the diagram on the top that has all the lines, that ensures that when the regulation is placed on a package, it isn't distorted. We also spend quite a lot of time thinking through how one might go about defining what the front of a package is, because in most instances, the size of the logos is based on a percentage of what a front of package is. But in many regulations in South America, how that is defined is left entirely up to industry. And so what we've seen is, for example, they've chosen odd sections of the package to define as the front, or they've chosen where it's a round package to only define a small portion of that as the front. And so we looked at some of the different ways in which this could be done. And one of the ways that worked quite well was something that's used in graphic design, which is to use a formula depending on the shape of the product to calculate the surface area, and from that derive the size of the front of the package. So it's thinking about things like that that can be quite important. And then an additional component of all of this is to consider the enforceability of the regulation. We all are in intensely resource constrained settings where there probably isn't a dedicated regulator that's going to go from store to look at this issue. And so what we tried to look at is, how can we make it easy to ascertain whether or not this regulation is being complied with? And that involved things like making sure that the label is not obscured. So as soon as it's obscured, that's immediately an offense under the regulation, etc. So you want to look at how can you attach sanctions to violations of a regulation? How can you make the regulation easy to enforce? Beyond this, Alex Jones at the George Institute developed a framework that can be used to improve the regulatory form of specifically front-of-pack labeling systems. And this traverses 3 domains. The first is to look at the regulatory form. And really, one should prefer a mandatory label over a voluntary label, and one should prefer an interpretive label that indicates specifically unhealthfulness of food items over neutral labels or numeric labels. So when we're looking at the regulatory form, you can see that assessing it against the proposed framework that's been tested, we are complying with those 2 components in adopting a mandatory warning label. The second is to consider the regulatory substance. And you'll see that some of this aligns quite closely with what I've presented already. This framework, unfortunately, came out after I'd already started doing this work, but it was useful to look at it and see whether or not there were any gaps. And So the regulatory objective is incredibly important, and again, including specifications around the display, around the scope, and creating a valid scoring criteria, which was done by Tamron through the creation of the nutrient profiling model. All of those things are incredibly important. And then finally, it's really important to ensure that any front-of-pack labeling system is aligned with other types of policies, particularly health and nutrition policies. And so ensuring that those policies make mention of front-of-pack labeling before a labeling system is developed in your country can really assist in adopting that measure. And then the last component, which I think is probably the most difficult within an African context, is around regulatory governance. And here the watchword is really to ensure that there aren't conflicts of interest between who is responsible for enforcing the regulation and the vested interests that are affected by the regulation. So it's very important that it's independent bodies or government bodies that are monitoring and enforcing the regulation, that it's government officials and independent groups that are involved in developing the regulation and the design of the system. And it's also really important that when it comes to monitoring the impact of the regulation, that's also undertaken by independent groups. And in that regard, collecting baseline data before the system is implemented can also be quite important. The last issue I'll touch on is just the issue of trade challenges. So just to provide an overview, the way in which trade challenges work is that there's a regulation or law or other legal measure that is introduced that has implications for international trade. And that can be pretty much anything that involves products that may be being brought into the country or being exported from the country. And the concern when looking at something that has trade implications is really whether or not it's going to discriminate against or treat foreign entities differently to local entities. So there shouldn't be anything that could be read to be discriminatory against foreign actors. That's really the key to addressing these issues. So once a government considers whether or not to introduce this type of measure, they are required to notify the World Trade Organization. And one of two things can happen. Either a trade concern can be lodged or no concern can be lodged. After a trade concern is lodged, it's not actually a challenge. It's almost like a pre-step to say, we as a country are concerned about the trade implications of this particular measure. Can you please address our concerns? And then a government will typically file a response outlining its evidence showing that the measure is not discriminatory, and in certain instances may even consider to amend that regulation. After that response, it could be that the concern is resolved, or it could be that a challenge is filed. And we've seen in certain instances, in fact, in most instances concerning labeling issues, it hasn't gone past an issue of trade concern. It's ended pretty much at the stage of a government response, and there haven't been further challenges filed. So what are the potential trade challenges that may arise in the context of front-of-pack labeling? What we've observed based on previous challenges that have been filed is that there's really 5 key domains. The first is to argue that the front-of-pack label is not health related, and there having evidence is really important, and it doesn't necessarily need to be context specific evidence or local data. It can be things that are, for example, statements from the World Health Organization, from other groups, or referencing other scientific studies that support the notion of a front-of-pack label contributing to good health. The second, which is really tricky, is around the label being more trade restrictive than is necessary. And here, it's really the argument that other measures that are less restrictive would achieve the same purpose. And so here, studies like what Professor Swart undertook, where she compared a warning label to other types of measures and showed that one is more effective than another, becomes incredibly important, because it shows that this is actually the least restrictive measure to achieve that particular purpose. So as long as you can show that yours is the most effective, it can justify it being restrictive of trade. The third is that, and this I've touched on already, is the idea that the measure is discriminatory. And so here the key is to just make sure that you're not unduly targeting imported products. And that can really be accidental and indirect. So the other thing that one can do to ameliorate this is to create certain exceptions or certain flexibilities for imported products. And a really classic example of this is to allow imported products to carry a sticker with the logos as opposed to integrating it into the package. That can be undesirable for certain reasons, but that is an option if you're faced with a concern. The fourth is that a front of pack label is not in line with international standards. There isn't at the moment a particular international standard that applies to front of pack labeling. Different countries have adopted different types of labels. They've all followed different nutrient profiling models and things like that. So there isn't really one particular international standard that should be complied with. This would change if Codex Alimentarius were ever to include a standard for front of pack labeling. And so it's quite important to make sure that if that is changing anytime soon, to consider the impact of that on your particular research and response. One way to address that is to argue that your context is different and so requires adaptation. And then the final issue, which only arises in the context of challenges under what we call the sanitary and psychosanitary measures component of the World Trade Organization's agreements, is that it arouses fear in customers. And I think this is pretty adeptly dealt with through studies like what Ms. Popape did, where she looked at consumers' reactions to the particular label. So when responding to trade concerns, really the key is to ensure that you are providing clear and context-specific evidence in defending the measure that's being adopted. But also what's important to note is that the context now is different to what it was 3 or 4 years ago. More and more countries are beginning to adopt things like warning labels. And so at a certain point, there's going to be a broad enough evidence base from those other systems being adopted that context-specific evidence will no longer be necessary. And then it's also really just important to consider what steps one can take to ameliorate the trade impact of a regulation. And this may include accommodations for imported products. I hope this was helpful, and I'm available to answer any questions with the rest of my colleagues. Thank you very much for your attention.
Bonjour à tous. Hello?
Yeah, hello, continue.
Oui, ok, d'accord. Ok. Alors, merci beaucoup. Je suis Yassarah Onifade et je vais vous présenter les résultats phares de l'enquête marché portant sur la caractérisation de l'offre alimentaire dans les supermarchés de Dakar, une enquête conduite par le laboratoire de recherche en nutrition et alimentation humaine dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre du projet BIA Obesity au Sénégal. Comme plan, je vous propose tout d'abord d'aborder le contexte de l'étude, suivi des objectifs, la méthodologie qui a été utilisée, de présenter quelques résultats préliminaires et enfin, les limites et contraintes encourues au cours de la réalisation de cette étude. Alors, par rapport aux produits alimentaires non emballés, les aliments emballés ont tendance à être riches en nutriments préoccupants tels que le sucre ajouté, le sodium, les graisses saturées, les graisses trans, etc. Et donc, l'amélioration de la qualité des aliments emballés pourrait contribuer de manière significative à la réduction de l'obésité et des maladies liées à l'alimentation. À cet effet, l'OMS reconnaît le rôle crucial des entreprises alimentaires dans la création des environnements favorables à la saine alimentation et donc à identifier des rôles et actions que ces entreprises alimentaires pourront entreprendre pour contribuer à l'amélioration de nos environnements alimentaires. Et il s'agit notamment de la réduction de l'exposition de la population, en particulier des enfants, au marketing des aliments malsains, la reformulation des produits afin de limiter les teneurs en nutriments préoccupants, mais également l'amélioration de l'étiquetage nutritionnel pour vraiment orienter les choix des consommateurs. Et c'est dans ce cadre que le réseau Informas a mis en place l'outil BIA Obesity, qui est un processus visant à évaluer les entreprises du domaine alimentaire en fonction de leur politique et engagement en matière de la prévention de l'obésité et des maladies et de la nutrition de la population. Et l'une des étapes, majeures.
Sorry. Hello. Just to clarify something. If you need to hear the English version of the talk, please, there's a globe at the bottom of your screen says interpretation. Click on it and press English. Sorry, you can continue, please.
OK. Et donc, je disais que l'une des étapes majeures de ce processus d'évaluation est la sélection des entreprises alimentaires leaders. Et donc, en l'absence de données sur la part de marché des entreprises alimentaires au Sénégal, cette enquête marché a été initiée et les objectifs visés étaient d'identifier les entreprises alimentaires leaders par une estimation de leur part de marché par rapport aux variétés de produits, mais également de caractériser les profils nutritionnels et promotionnels de ces aliments, de ces produits alimentaires industrialisés. Donc, il s'agissait d'une étude transversale à visée descriptive qui a été réalisée dans la région de Dakar. Et donc, nous avions choisi d'investiguer dans cette région car non seulement étant la capitale, mais également parce qu'elle englobe la majorité de la population sénégalaise urbaine. Et initialement, 6 chaînes de supermarchés ayant un nombre important d'enseignes dans la capitale ont été ciblées. Il s'agissait de Auchan, Casino, EDK Low Price, Exclusive, Carrefour, Utile. Et ainsi, des demandes d'autorisation préalable ont été adressées aux managers de ces supermarchés. Mais finalement, l'enquête n'a pu se réaliser que dans les 2 supermarchés répondants. Il s'agit notamment de l'hypermarché Auchan, qui est localisé à Mermoz, et l'hypermarché Exclusive sur la VDN pyrotechnique. Alors, concernant la planification de cette étude, tout d'abord, un outil de collecte a été élaboré basé sur les standards de l'OMS par rapport à la catégorisation des aliments et des boissons non alcoolisées. Au total, 6 enquêteurs ont participé. 6 enquêteurs ont participé à la réalisation de la collecte des données et ils ont été formés préalablement sur l'étiquetage nutritionnel des produits, les allégations nutritionnelles, les pratiques promotionnelles, la classification NOVA des aliments, mais également la composition des aliments. Avant le démarrage de cette étude également, un pré-test a été réalisé dans l'un des magasins afin vraiment d'ajuster l'outil de collecte. L'enquête proprement dite a été conduite dans la période de août à septembre 2021 à des moments de la journée où il y avait moins d'affluence dans les supermarchés afin de ne pas perturber le rythme commercial des ventes. Mais aussi, il faut noter que les équipes étaient bien organisées pour vraiment éviter les erreurs de doublons dans la collecte des données, mais également les agglutinations dans les rayons. Ils étaient bien organisés pour collecter des données de qualité. Alors, les données collectées concernaient majoritairement le nom du produit alimentaire, la marque, les distributeurs et ou sociétés fabricantes, la présence ou non de la liste des ingrédients, la valeur nutritionnelle présentée sous forme de panneau ou non, la présence et l'emplacement de l'apport journalier recommandé, mais aussi la composition nutritionnelle en termes de macronutriments pour 100 grammes ou 100 millilitres du produit alimentaire et enfin les pratiques promotionnelles et les allégations nutritionnelles observées sur l'emballage des produits. Alors, concernant les résultats de cette enquête, à l'issue de l'enquête, 7398 produits étaient répertoriés et la grande majorité des produits collectés concernaient les catégories de fruits et légumes en conserve, mais également les boissons rafraîchissantes non alcoolisées, où plus de 1000 produits ont été collectés pour chacune de ces catégories. Alors, concernant l'étiquetage nutritionnel des produits, environ 92% des produits de notre base de données présentaient une liste des ingrédients et seulement moins de 6% de ces produits, de cette proportion de produits, présentait cette information sur le devant de l'emballage. Cependant, moins de la moitié des produits répertoriés présentaient une liste quantitative des ingrédients. Concernant la valeur nutritionnelle, la présence de la valeur nutritionnelle, donc elle était présente sur environ 4 produits sur 5, mais seulement moins de 10% de ces produits présentaient également cette information sur le devant de l'emballage. Alors, par rapport à la présence de l'apport journalier recommandé, il faut noter qu'environ un produit sur 4 avait présenté cette information. Donc, la présence de l'apport journalier recommandé était relativement très faible sur les emballages des produits, mais également près de 10% des produits répertoriés faisaient l'objet de pratiques promotionnelles. Et lorsque nous faisons la triangulation de toutes ces données par rapport aux catégories de produits alimentaires, on se rend compte que la présence de la liste des ingrédients était relativement plus faible dans les catégories de fruits et légumes en conserve, mais également des boissons rafraîchissantes. Et l'absence de la liste quantitative des ingrédients était majoritairement plus prononcée dans les catégories de confiserie, fruits et légumes en conserve, les croustilles et les snacks. Cependant, pour les croustilles, moins de la moitié des produits présentaient des valeurs nutritionnelles sous forme de panneaux. Quant aux allégations nutritionnelles, elles étaient beaucoup plus importantes respectivement dans les catégories de produits, dans les catégories des produits transformés à base de pommes de terre, les fruits et légumes en conserve, la catégorie des pains et produits de boulangerie, les céréales et produits céréaliers, mais également la catégorie des confiseries. Et pour ce qui est des confiseries, notons que dans cette catégorie, un produit sur 2 faisait l'objet de pratiques promotionnelles, tandis que dans les catégories de pain et produits de boulangerie, les céréales et produits céréaliers, les produits laitiers, nous avions noté environ 15% de produits de promotion sur ces produits. Alors, concernant les allégations, notons que plus de la moitié des produits présentaient une allégation nutritionnelle sur l'emballage. Et les types d'allégations les plus représentés étaient majoritairement les allégations liées à la protection de l'environnement, telles que l'agriculture bio, etc. Mais également concernant les allégations nutritionnelles, les plus majoritairement représentées étaient les allégations relatives à la santé, telles que le non-ajout d'additifs, de colorants, la sécurité sanitaire des produits, mais également les allégations relatives à la teneur en éléments nutritifs. Pour la majorité de ces allégations, elles étaient présentées sous format verbal et cependant localisées sur le devant des emballages. Alors, concernant les pratiques promotionnelles, comme je l'ai souligné tout à l'heure, près de 10% des produits répertoriés faisaient l'objet de pratiques promotionnelles. Et les techniques promotionnelles les plus représentées étaient l'utilisation des personnages de dessins animés ou des personnages d'entreprise, l'utilisation de caractères amusants sur l'emballage, de caractères amusants pour les enfants sur l'emballage des produits, mais également les offres premium telles que le rabais des prix, les offres supplémentaires, les cadeaux ou les objets de collection, etc. Alors, concernant la part de marché des entreprises alimentaires, donc nos résultats d'enquête nous ont également permis d'identifier, d'estimer, de pouvoir estimer la part de marché des entreprises alimentaires. Et donc, ce sont les entreprises internationales et ou régionales qui représentent la grande majorité des produits sur le marché comparé à nos entreprises locales telles que Zena Exotic Fruits, Patisen, Poultry, CDA, etc. Aussi bien dans la fabrication des produits emballés que celle des boissons non alcoolisées. Alors, où nos entreprises alimentaires locales avaient relativement une part de marché très faible. Alors, l'enquête marché également nous a permis d'identifier les 25 entreprises alimentaires leaders. Et parmi celles-ci, la part de marché des entreprises étrangères était relativement 6 fois plus élevée que celle des entreprises locales. Par rapport aux limites et contraintes rencontrées au cours de la réalisation de cette étude, tout d'abord, ça a été l'adhérence, le faible niveau d'adhérence des supermarchés a participé à cette enquête, ce qui a considérablement limité la collecte des données, mais également la durée de l'investigation qui a été relativement plus longue que prévu. Mais aussi, nous avions rencontré des difficultés en ce qui concerne l'administration du questionnaire pour quelques produits où les écritures sur les emballages étaient quasi illisibles en raison de la couleur de l'emballage, mais aussi de la taille de police utilisée par les industriels. Alors, en résumé, nous pouvons dire qu'au total, 25 entreprises alimentaires leaders ont été identifiées à travers cette enquête marché. Et donc, les entreprises internationales et ou régionales étaient les plus représentées. Et donc aussi, la grande majorité des produits collectés concernaient la catégorie des fruits et légumes en conserve et celle des boissons rafraîchissantes non alcoolisées. Et seulement un produit sur 4 avait présenté un apport journalier recommandé sur l'emballage. Et plus de la moitié des produits répertoriés ne présentaient pas une liste quantitative des ingrédients. Notons également que la grande majorité des allégations nutritionnelles étaient plus axées sur des allégations relatives à la teneur en nutriments, mais également les autres allégations relatives à la santé comme la sécurité sanitaire des produits, la certification des produits, etc. Et la grande majorité de ces allégations étaient présentées sous format verbal et sur le devant des emballages. Comme pratique, comme technique promotionnelle les plus utilisées, c'était l'utilisation des personnages de dessins animés. Je vous remercie pour votre attention.